Hello, everyone. My name is Betty Cruz, and I'm the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. It's so great to be here with you. Our mission at the council is to convene and connect people around global issues to build a thriving, competitive, and inclusive Pittsburgh. And our vision is for a globally minded, globally connected world that is equitable and just for all. Equitable and just for all. I just wanted to let those words land, because as we look at everything that's happening in the world, including what we're going to talk about here today, those words take on deeper and new meaning, for me at least. And I hope you feel them deeply as well. Now, before we jump into today's program, we want to also acknowledge for all who are joining us from around the region, in Pittsburgh, and around the world, that we're located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, including the Seneca, Lenape, Osage, and Shawnee. Through this acknowledgement, we invite you to join us in paying respect to the elders, both past and present. Now, let's get into today's program. We are thrilled to partner with the Pittsburgh Ballet, and I'd like to welcome Lisa Aul, Manager of Audience Education and Archives at the Pittsburgh Ballet, to introduce today's program. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Betty, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This program is the second of a two-part series inspired by PBT's current production of Swan Lake at the Benedum Center. Swan Lake is a ballet of absolutely transcendent beauty that has captured imaginations for more than 150 years. It's also a great work of art that continues to carry potent cultural and ideological meaning around the context of its creation, as we saw in our program last week, as well as taking on new significance in the complex socio-political context of today's world. And it's the perfect backdrop for our discussion today. And we are honored to welcome our moderator for today's conversation, Mila Sanina. Mila is an independent journalist, writer, and editor based here in Pittsburgh. And until 2022, Mila served as the executive director of Public Source, a nonprofit newsroom delivering public service journalism in the Pittsburgh region at publicsource.org. Under Mila's leadership, Public Source has been billed as an innovative, independent newsroom known for its deep local reporting on issues of environment, police accountability, local government, health, education, and economic development. Public Source continues telling stories for a better Pittsburgh. Before joining Public Source in 2016, Mila worked for 5 years at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where her last position was as the deputy managing editor. Prior to the Post-Gazette, Mila worked at the PBS NewsHour, CNN International. She started her reporting career in Central Asia. A native of Almaty, Kazakhstan, Mila holds a master's degree from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh and a bachelor's degree from the American University in Bulgaria. Most of Mila's family lives in Kazakhstan, some are in Russia, and she has further family connections in Ukraine. And it is now my pleasure to turn it over to Mila to lead today's program. Mila, take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. We'll be moving to the audience Q&A portion of our program a little later on. I will start the question with my questions that we prepared before this conversation, but we do invite you to submit your questions for our panelists throughout the event in the Q&A feature. Thank you very much to the Pittsburgh Ballet Theatre, All for All, and the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh for hosting this important conversation about the role of the arts as cultural export and for trusting me to guide it. We are honored to engage in a conversation today with Dr. Adriana Helbig and Elsa Limbach. I'd first like to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Elsa, would you like to go first?
All right, thank you very much. Very pleased to be here and join you for this conversation. I actually am Pittsburgher by birth. I grew up here and began my dance training here many, many years ago. I started as a classical ballet wannabe, let's say, but I discovered contemporary dance and found that that was really the right home for me. I was a founding member of a company called Dance Alloy that had a 35+ year run here in the city. And I danced in the company for 15 years, and many of those years as its artistic director. I had the tremendous opportunity to live off and on for approximately 5 years in Bulgaria from late 1989 through 1995. I was back and forth many times, including having a Fulbright lectureship at the National Theatre Academy there. So that was an important part of my career. I've spent a lot of my life in the dance field and in arts education, and currently continue my connection to the arts as a board member of the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council, and I still do some teaching. I just wanted to add one other little thing, that my introduction to dance as a theater art actually came in the iconic Civic Arena, which is no longer in Pittsburgh, but it was way back in 1966 when my mother took me to see Swan Lake with the Bolshoi Ballet. And it was only years later that I realized that part of why I was so deeply inspired by that performance is it was the great ballerina Maya Plasitskaya who danced the role of Odette Odile. So this was my introduction to seeing ballet on stage. So it was wonderful to come again this past weekend and see PBT's great production, and particularly the really sensitive second act pas de deux. I was impressed with that. So anyway, I won't take any more time, but that's just a little bit about me, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Adriana?
Thank you very much for including me in this prestigious panel. I am honored to be here as a musician. So I teach music at the University of Pittsburgh. I write about hip hop and Romani music, focus on minority musics in Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine many times. As I was listening to Elsa speak of her experiences, I was reminded of my childhood experiences with ballet. I was very quickly moved to become the piano player, which I do think is a very important part of this whole experience, dancing to live music. And I worked for many years with the Sizukryli Ukrainian Dance Ensemble, New York-based folk Ukrainian dance ensemble that had a workshop. And actually its connection to Pittsburgh is that many students from that group, run by Roma Prima Bohachevska, eventually became Duquesne Tamburitsin dancers. And her hopak, the famous Ukrainian show everything that you can dance, is actually still the finale for the Duquesne for the Tamburitsins at this point. So thank you again, and I hope to share what I can to this panel.
Thank you so much, and so glad that we were able to make it happen, this panel. So I'd like to first start with a very general question. Given the topic of our conversation today, I'd like to ask each of you to speak to the power of art as it relates to global conflict and pain. And how have you observed in your artistic journeys how dance and music are being created in response to conflicts as a way to channel political concerns or issues globally? Adriana, why don't you start?
I'm recently just finishing a book on Romani music, and in the introduction to that book, I contemplate on the fact that for many years of my life, I did not see music or the arts as entertainment. I was raised in a situation where I viewed the arts as a way to get the political message across. It was a diaspora community of refugees, grew up in New Jersey, Ukrainian Americans, mostly from the western parts of Ukraine. And very often we were dressed in Ukrainian costumes, we sang, we danced, and these types of ways to get that message across. First, it's a way to capture people's interest People will always respond to colorful costumes. When you look a little bit just right underneath the surface of that, whether you're looking at song lyrics or the types of choreographies that people put on, the messaging tends to be very clear, especially in the Ukrainian American community, where Ukraine as an entity tends to be represented as a woman who is protected by Cossack men who are then fighting against the oppressor.
Mm-hmm. Elsa?
Wow, I'm sorry, I'm just a little breathless from just thinking about that image and feeling as you must feel, Adriana, right now with everything that's happening in Ukraine. My partner is Ukrainian, so these issues of the geopolitical reality is very real at this moment. But in a more general way, certainly, you know, the arts play a role both as a representation, as you described, of a certain way of thinking about a community or a certain group of people, and they can also be a challenge to status quo. You know, having started in classical dance and then shifting over into the contemporary dance world, one of the things that I experienced is how it can be such an interesting way of kind of nibbling around the edges or of subverting, coming up from below and sort of making the public or making artists themselves aware of a different way of expression. And this can have a very important political connotation of, what can be considered art, and how one of the teachers that I had early on in my modern training was Carolyn Brown, who was a principal dancer for Merce Cunningham for 20 years. And when she talked about how in some of their early European tours, they had tomatoes tossed at them. And then the Cunningham Company became an entity that was, really celebrated widely as people began to understand how he was playing with the whole idea of what constituted dance on stage, that there were many options, and how the influence of the contemporary has had an impact on even the ballet world and the making of even the remaking of classics and so forth. So there's a very complex dialogue, I think, that goes on, and for me it became very personal when I was living in Bulgaria, and it was 1993, early in that, well, actually it started in late 92, the project. I was commissioned by a ballet company, their modern ballet company, the Ballet Arabesque, to do some new work. And living in Bulgaria at that moment, there was war in the former Yugoslavia, and that was very close. And even though we didn't have the moment by moment way to watch what's happening as we do in Ukraine now, enough was filtering to me, even with my very bad Bulgarian at that point. I was trying to learn the language, but to have a sense of the horror that was happening there, and horror between people that had been living beside each other for long periods of time, and as we're seeing take place today. And so it drove me to make a piece in response to that I, in Bulgarian, is pod ognja ne svojite, and in English, friendly fire. The idea that even as humans broadly, we end up killing our own. And so it was, just a chance to respond. And it was a very moving project for me, for the dancers I was working with, and then ultimately for the public that came to see it, particularly in that moment where it was quite palpable in Bulgaria that the neighboring country had fallen apart and was at war. So anyway.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see how art, dance, and other forms of artistic expression are used both by people, but also in Russia and in the Soviet Union. Art has been or was and is weaponized by some authoritarian regimes, even beyond the former Soviet Union as a way to coerce artists, right? Quell protests in some case, shape the narratives of power and regimes and what are the proper art. What thoughts do you have about that? How, on one hand, art and dance can be expression of deeper feelings, but it also could be a way for authoritarian regimes, for dictators to use for their own, to quell protest, to in a way quiet people and make sure that the message of power and is disseminated to control potential opposition. Adriana, do you have any thoughts on that?
There's an excellent book written on this by Anthony Shea called Choreographic Politics. And this is something that I read very early on in my graduate career, going back to the 1990s. So this is actually one of the issues that happens, because when you consider that governments put on state dance ensembles, and when we're thinking of the Soviet Union, I mean, this is the model that many, especially socialist countries followed. If we're looking throughout the African continent, if we're also looking, the Ballet Folklorico of Mexico, when you're using ballet as a unifying step formation, and then imposing folk costumes onto a ballet structure, where essentially many of the character dances then become very similar, right? So that's actually how the Soviet Union actually successfully, and I will say successfully, created a nation through dance, right? With all of these ethnic groups. What then happens in these former Soviet countries, and we see this actually now coming out of Ukraine from the battlefield, where you actually have Moiseyev type dancing being conducted by Ukrainian dancers who are replicating this from Virsky, already from the Ukrainian folk ensembles, and then how people are playing with and against that history. So how do you engage with what is Ukrainian in this particular case, or in what is a specific dance relating and correlating to a specific ethnicity? One of the challenges when you're looking at some of these things is they're actually impossible to dance unless you are a professionally trained dancer. And so then how does that relate to what everyday dance actually is in a lot of these contexts? So, this really brings out a lot of what Elsa was saying in terms of context-based dancing. Where do you perform a dance? What kind of information is then gleaned by a certain audience in one context or in another context across the Atlantic, and at certain times? How do you relate to dance when it's live, or when we see it on YouTube, when it's something that's from 20 years ago or 50 years ago? How do you replicate a certain dance, right? So all of these are fascinating questions.
Elsa, power and art, oppression and art. Any thoughts?
Well, lots of thoughts, but I mean, just going back to my own experience when I, landed in Bulgaria, it was at this time of transition, and so, it was the late summer '89, and in November the Berlin Wall falls. There are changes in the political structure. A first sort of free election happens in June '90 in Bulgaria. But the art scene that I landed in was, up until that point, very state operated, state controlled. So not only were all pretty much, I think, all of the entities, theaters, music ensembles, dance companies, were part of this state cultural structure. Each one had a political officer that made sure what you did was appropriate. And so the very first thing I was invited to be involved in 1990, I didn't even know, because I was so naive, that it was being kind of looked at by somebody. But it was actually one of the first new theaters that came out in this sort of opening. And so in those first years of transition, there were so many new little ensembles that appeared, and people that had not been allowed to come through the state structures, we're now free to start something. And so that was an amazing experience to work with folks, but also to just observe this very organic and energetic response to what had been a very rigid situation. But I think about our own situation in the arts in the United States. And so we have, a very different, privately, the state subsidy or, government subsidy for the arts is very thin in the United States compared to our Western European counterparts, for instance. I don't know if the numbers are still accurate, but at some point in time recently, the whole national endowment budget for the entire United States of 330 plus million people was not as large as the city of Berlin's budget for the arts. And so what we rely on in the United States is private funding, and what that means for who's seen and who's not seen, and the effort that it takes. And there's sometimes even, and I can't think of who the choreographer was, but I read about it recently. He's a very important contemporary choreographer, but his company was having trouble just dealing with the day-to-day running, and they were behind in their IRS filings, and they were having all of these issues about raising money. So fortunately, I don't know if it's the Joyce Theater, but another entity sort of took them under their fiscal umbrella so that this choreographer could just continue to do his work, because sometimes the economic barriers in our very free market system can be its own kind of way of holding back artistic expression. Though it is interesting in the times we have now with new media, one, it brings a certain kind of democratization maybe, but I'm not someone who really understands the YouTube world or the Facebook world. I'm a little bit older generation, and I imagine that it has its own stumbling things. So I think it's a really important thing to always be aware that there's a constant push and pull between what allows us to have this human expression and for it to be shared widely, and the various kinds of, whether it's political power or economic power, that really become the controlling factors in determining what's out there for the wider public. So I guess sort of long around winded.
No, actually, that's a perfect segue into my question for Adriana. Your first book, Hip Hop, Ukraine, Music, Race, and African Migration, is the first ethnographically based analysis of hip hop in Ukraine and stems from long-term research among Ukrainian and African musicians in Ukraine and Uganda. Many people may not know that Ukraine, I did not before I didn't see and checked out your book, that Ukraine receives the fourth largest number of migrants globally after the United States, Canada, and the Russian Federation. And your book specifically sheds light on experiences of African migrants and student populations in the former Soviet Union through an analysis of Cold War discourse on race in music performance. So my question is, how does such analysis of race in music performance help us understand the experiences of marginalized groups? And what have you discovered through your research about the experiences of these groups, specifically African migrants, during times of conflict in Ukraine?
Well, so I think before launching into the race element, one of the things to really consider is the intersectionality of race and gender as well here. And to Elsa's point, I've been always wondering, why is it that the United States doesn't support, especially dance, and concepts of religion, relationships to the body are very much at the forefront of all of this, as is masculinity. And so the representation of male bodies in ballet in relation and in opposition oftentimes to the way that male bodies are represented in folk dancing, and to what I'm leading to, masculinity is very closely tied to dance, especially in Eastern and Central Europe. So if you are a man and you don't dance, that also shows that you are not demonstrating the type of power that you would typically have in a village setting, for instance. So when we're looking at hip hop, you know, dance is an element of that, the body movements, right? It's very iconic when you're looking at the ways that body movement is borrowed around the world. And especially with hip hop, the way that young men especially move their bodies is in replica to African-American videos, especially those coming out from the 1990s from the United States. So there was a parallel in Ukraine of young men growing up. Actually, we see these mostly those parts of the cities that are now bombed. Those were called spalni rayone, or sleeping regions, and those were big buildings that were built after the war to accommodate the post-war population. Those regions typically don't have much beyond those buildings, and when you were a young man growing up in the 1990s with not that much going for you in those regions, young men actually replicated hip hop groups, and they became, not to use the word gang, but groups of men that were helping each other. And what happens is the Soviet Union had a very, very long history of sponsoring students from the African continent, from Latin America, from the Caribbean. When those young men came, because mostly it was men that were coming in to study into Kharkiv in the eastern parts, they started to join these groups of local Ukrainian men. And so it became an interracial way of supporting each other. On one hand, they were validating the Blackness of the hip hop genre. So there was sort of a racial exchange and validation there. On the other hand, those groups were used, you know, as a way to protect Africans who were obviously in the minority in Eastern Ukraine. It's very typical, though, when you see a student from Africa that people really recognize what that history is. The difference is that in Ukraine, they've now stayed, and many have married and many have children. And so there's an interracial generation that's now growing up. We heard a lot about this at the borders on the western parts where you know, especially the Western media was picking up on alleged discrimination on the borders, both from the Ukrainian side and once they crossed. That again is a gendered thing, because men were not being allowed to go on trains. And they weren't the first ones that were leaving. So, you know, there are different types of stories. There's stories of musicians that then reverted back to their friends groups, found them, and then helped each other escape, moving backwards, you know, moving westward across the country. So, you know, all of these nuances are just coming out, and the young people on the cover of my book were recently able to get out of Ukraine. They're now safely in Berlin, but you know, just getting in contact with them and hearing that they were in a metro station in Kharkiv, you know, just the horrors of all of this are really very much at the forefront. What's interesting about Ukraine is that a lot of women are now involved in the hip hop scene, and so again, women like Alena. So they're talking about body positivity. And again, just there is that very strong connection to the US and sort of cycling back. And you know, there are groups that don't drink, that don't do drugs, and, you know, all of that, you know, positive body relationship that's moving out of that socialist, post-socialist, early post-socialist chaos that was being experienced, especially going up until about 2010 in Ukraine. Yeah.
Wow, how fascinating. Elsa, I want to talk a little bit about your work following your work with Dance Alloy. You performed, taught, coached, and choreographed for a wide variety of dance companies and theatrical groups. And as you mentioned, including in Bulgaria, where you lived for several years. And where your time working in Bulgaria also coincided with the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and it inspired you to create a dance piece titled Friendly Fire. Can you talk to us about your process and inspiration in creating this piece and what it meant for you?
Yes, thank you. You know, it was it was a time of very deep emotion, actually, to, as I started to work on it. And as I said, I had been awarded this commission to create some work for the Ballet Arabesque. And outside of the ballet, the opera, the Bulgarian National Opera, which was their classical ballet company, and then also they provided the dancing for opera scenes. But this was probably the next ranking company outside of the folk ensembles in Bulgaria at that time that grew out in the communist period. But they were a little bit more, they had a little bit different kind of repertoire than the classical group, though the dancers were all classically trained. And so my relationship with the company began first. One of the dancers had gotten to know me when I worked on another project that was a private project, and really enjoyed my teaching. And so she prevailed upon the artistic director, Margarita Arnaudova, to invite me to teach the company. And so I began with just some workshop and teaching company class for a period of time, which allowed me to get to know the dancers, and then them to get to know me, and to try to find a middle ground between my approach to movement and the way they had been trained. So that was, kind of a first step, and a really important one. So when the director, when Margarita Arnaudova asked me to create something for the company, I was very touched and very honored. And I actually made two works. But Friendly Fire, I was, what I could learn from what was happening as Yugoslavia had disintegrated and the war was happening in Bosnia, and I was very, I was just disturbed by this. It was just something that was, it was like going around in my head and going around in my body, and so I actually came back to Pittsburgh for just a brief time at the Christmas holiday or the winter holiday. And my stepbrother, who was a composer, we had a chance to meet. And I said to Michael, his name's Michael Menard, and I said to Michael, would you like to do a score for this piece? Because I don't know what music I can find that's really going to help me tell this story. And I didn't want to have a very literal scenario. It was more, it's more a series of scenes that kind of get to the visceral and kinetic feeling of upheaval, of conflict, of despair, and the denouement, the ending scene it actually ends in a very quiet way after all of this sort of rumbling. And I said, can you work on this with me? And he said, I'd love to. So this is, back in the 90s. So we didn't have all the technology that we have now. So it was him working electronically and sending me these little cassette tapes that would come in the mail, and mail to Bulgaria was not quick. So I'd be working with, like a partially made thing. But it was so moving for me because the dancers, they believed in the project, and my language skills were very limited at that point. I was trying to learn the language, but I talked like a 5-year-old, but they made the effort to understand me, and we could understand each other in that, dance kinetic language. So it was a quite remarkable experience. It was it was cathartic for me in a way to process just the despair and the horror I felt about what was going on. And I think for those that I worked with too. And so it was that in that way, a very important project of that time of my career.
Thank you for sharing that memory. I have a question. We have received a couple of, a few questions actually that was submitted by the youth. And one of these questions is actually around, whose culture do we engage with, and what is the importance? The question specifically is, worded like this: with the destruction of Ukrainian cultural landmarks and overall efforts to assimilate Ukrainian culture into Russia, many would argue that greater emphasis must be placed on preserving and celebrating Ukrainian heritage. Why is it important to engage with Russian culture during this time? Adriana, do you have, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I am definitely one who feels that everyone needs a voice. So this is not a time to censor. I don't believe that. I believe that the dialogue is there. On the other hand, I think what we need to recognize, especially at at the University of Pittsburgh or any other way that we engage with culture, especially through our institutions, is that the dominant engagement has been with Russian culture to date. So when we're looking at the Pittsburgh Symphony, for instance, when they played Tchaikovsky's symphonies, we're not playing the others simply because the narrative has always been silenced. We have this situation at the University of Pittsburgh where Russian language courses, Russian history courses, Russian music courses, everything is sponsored by the university. Any other course that is non-Russian has to be sponsored by the community. And it has to do with these colonial networks. And, in music, we've worked to decolonialize our offerings in music. With that in particular, that meant jazz, right? So jazz historically, the word jazz, meaning noise, has historically replicated the politics, the racial politics of the United States, where things had been silenced, right? So we have to recognize to what degree has this actually played out when it comes to Russian, Soviet narratives, and make space, not just for Ukrainians, but for Georgians, when we're looking at all the other groups that have really not had that space, simply either because their people have either become cast as Russian, for instance, are they Russian speaking? Did they study in Moscow, et cetera, et cetera. So that decolonialization is what is actually necessary at this time.
Elsa, what do you think?
Well, I know it's a loaded question, and we had some conversation. There was some conversation in the previous panel last week that I listened in on, and I know there are some in the community that feel at this time should we be showing or listening to these Russian works when Russia is at this moment this terrible aggressor, but maybe part of, I think these two panels are a response to just at least having some dialogue around this question. And then I would also suggest that we really make the effort to look into these other cultural spaces, many which have been suppressed for so long. My partner is a musicologist, a pianist, Taras Filanko, and he is Ukrainian, and he is someone who has spent part of his career writing about Mila Sanina, who is a very important Ukrainian composer, but he's not known the way Bartok is known or Grieg is known and so forth, because of the constant ongoing repression of Ukrainian cultural space. And to connect to something that Adriana studies, one of the things that Lisenko did that was really interesting is he collected folk music not only of typically Ukrainian populations, but of many other populations as well. And he was someone who was interested in a range of cultural expressions, but many of his things were published in Leipzig because he couldn't have them published in Ukraine under the Russian Empire. And he also was someone who put on stage for the first time a blind banderist who was a representative of the long history, oral history of Ukrainian culture and music. And he put this man on the stage in St. Petersburg, and in a way it's like bringing, you know, the music from the street to the stage, just as, you know, many modern dance choreographers look to the hip hop world, or look to, you know, the street performers, and, or, you know, many composers have looked to jazz or other kinds of musical expression, and found them very rich sources of artistic inspiration. So this attitude actually has existed in Ukraine for a lot, you know, going back into the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, specifically with Lysenko. But so I think that it's good we're taking this moment, though. At least we are having a conversation about this, and maybe these conversations and the performances that are happening locally in various other places of specifically Ukrainian music right now is a chance for just you know, those of us who are not so connected to open our vision and take a new look.
Yeah, and just as a thank you to Taras Filanko, because I benefit from the work that Taras Filanko has done. So, for instance, his book is in the chair's music office that I now occupy at the Department of Music, because his advisor was the former chair. And just to say, it's actually very difficult to publish on Ukrainian themes in the United States still, because when you consider how long a professor tends to be in a position, right? So if you're thinking tenure process or however it is, the publication system is also that way, where the older faculty tend to be on boards. And, you know, it's very humbling for a professor to admit that perhaps what they wrote 50 years ago is not correct. And when you're looking at, again, some of these scholars that write about Soviet narratives, for now to then say, well, actually, we omitted some of these ethnic groups, or we were part of this colonial structure by promoting certain projects. And again, Taras Filanko writes against all of this in the United States as well, because it's Russian classical music that dominates the musicological sphere. And his concerts now that he's doing. So the internet is really helping as well, right? So we now have recordings of all of these musics that we're able to share. And that was the first thing that we did as the bombs fell, is we put together a resource, www.ethnomusicology.org/Ukraine, where we put together bibliography and all the media representation that we did, because we needed to get ahead of the story. We know how fake news works in the Soviet Union, in the Russian sphere. We see this now with Putin, and we knew as scholars that we needed to just promote certain types of music. And we also knew that music and dance would be the first things that people would have questions about. Young journalists call every day asking for help to understand where this actually comes from. So thank you again for organizing this, because it's almost like, unless you've lived through this, you wouldn't believe the depths that a certain movement or a certain song or a certain intonation or an instrument have. The blind musician, for instance, that you brought out. I mean, this evokes the history going back to the 19th century and the 1930s, when most bandurists were murdered by the Soviet regime because they could not be controlled. And I think the greater research needs to be done on dance, because, again, yes, you can silence a musician, but what do you have to do to a person's body to prevent them from dancing, right?
Yeah, you know, Adriana, as you were talking about colonization and how main narratives that are popular in the United States are formed, it become, you know, coming from Kazakhstan, it's very difficult, you know, to convey what Kazakh culture is about, because it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan was one of the countries where the native population was not the majority population. It was primarily Russian. And when you're talking about the nomads culture of Kazakh, how do you codify those songs, those dances? Like, if you do not have the written word, it's all going through the nomadic traditions of oral sort of information sharing. And that becomes even harder, where when you're publishing papers or writing something, we tend to, fall to the written word, and that's just not exactly the method that people share art or, transfer it. So thank you for sharing that.
And just to push that narrative one more step, so that the research on Kazakh music is then done in Russian, right?
Yep.
And so when you're looking at the Slavic system here of academia in the States, then professors simply say, well, don't learn Kazakh, you might as well learn Russian, because
That's right.
all of it's written in, and so there it goes, and there it goes, and there it goes. So this is kind of what we're I would say up against, but we've historically been working with.
Yeah, that's so deep, and like how do you uproot this history, right? And how do you learn and have enough of a lifetime to have all of these perspectives? Again, we have a few minutes left, and I want to remind our audience, if you have questions for our distinguished panelists, please submit them in Q&A window. I have two more questions that I wanted to ask. One is about, the time of war or oppression, and what kind of impact can they have on the development of art? Sometimes, yes, there are fertile grounds for developing literature. And I actually recently listened to a podcast where a Ukrainian philosopher said that, this is as devastating and as heartbreaking the Russian aggression is going to be for Ukraine. It's also going to be the time when artists and philosophers produce the best works, because it's usually in times of war where people create, very strong values, their strong means of expression against destruction and against, erasure that is happening. And he actually channeled the Odyssey and said that, reminded in that conversation, the Odyssey begins after the end of Trojan War. And so that's when you have Homer, writing about this time that distilled and allowed for such a thriving environment for art. What do you have any thoughts on how war and this time of oppression can influence Ukrainian art or any art worldwide? Adriana?
Oh, I have so many thoughts, but the first thing I'll say is that Putin has created his worst nightmare. So while this sense of national consciousness has been growing and it's been uniting, again, remember that a country like Ukraine has many different histories, many different approaches to religion and language. Now that there's so many people who are displaced, one of the things that's actually happened is many people from Eastern Ukraine that, for instance, didn't speak Ukrainian are now in the Western parts of the country. And the colleague just said that they were putting on a Ukrainian language course online. They expected maybe 20 people and 1,000 people signed up. Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at, again, sort of this growth of consciousness, that's very much there. The other thing is there's been a lot of, especially in the earlier parts of the war, is this a time for musicians to make music, or is this a time to be active somewhere else? And very quickly it shifted to, yes, this is the time to make music. There are a lot of people that are very traumatized, that are feeling that their creative elements have left them, but there are others that are now stepping in place and are creating spaces for healing. So I think just one of the things to just recognize is that it goes in waves. The initial waves that we saw in Ukraine, they were songs that people knew, they had instruments with them, they were creating right on the spot. As they start to join with their friends or with people back from their village, we're starting to see more of that repertoire. Female repertoires are coming forward. Children's repertoires came forward. Children's dance groups, those images started to circulate in early April when some of the fighting subsided in certain cases. So again, and now, the creativity is just blossoming just because everybody, there's been a bit of reprieve in certain cases, and people have access to their computers and the internet, and it's just flooding. What's interesting is that in different parts of the world, certain elements replicate. And I don't know yet what's happening from Ukraine right now, but from 2014, if you remember, there were images of pianos being rolled out onto streets, and there was a lot of public music making, and we see the pianos again now. Images from Syria, there was a pianist out there, he would roll his piano out onto the rubble. And again, that replica and that dialogue of people sharing their experiences worldwide is very, very powerful in the arts. That's what the arts do, they unite.
Elsa, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I think Adriana covered it pretty fully, but I can only imagine, because I'm not there, what this must feel like. My partner has a friend who plays in the opera orchestra, and for a period of time, because of the situation in Kyiv and the uncertainty, there were curfews, people couldn't move freely about the city. Her instrument was in the opera house, and she couldn't have her violin. And this was maddening to her, because this is like an extension of herself. So the disruption of war, and I can only imagine about dancers when here we have this pandemic, and for a long period of time, dancers couldn't collect together physically in the same space. And so much about dance is that physical communication of the body and that physical experience. And now, with all of the chaos in the country, they're subjected to this terrorizing, and it's something that lives in the body. You don't forget that anxiety. But I do agree that there will be also, it'll be fascinating to see the manifestations of this time. Let's just hope that the horror can subside, that Ukraine can free itself of this horrible aggression, so that there can be this time of flowering, and that we have the benefit of enjoying it. But it is remarkable that in this time, because of the internet, because of the communication, we are able to see these moments when artists go out into the rubble and take their bandura or take their violin or roll the piano, and we have this. It is truly one of the most wonderful things of humankind, when we see that humankind can also be so violent and destructive, that music and dance and other forms of artistic expression can show our better side.
Yeah, people are saying that the arts humanize. So when you can return to the arts, you're returning to your human essence.
Yeah, for sure. And it's I think I was at a talk by Isabel Wilkerson, and she shared this quote from Leo Tolstoy, again, Russian quote, but he said that art is a transfer of emotions. How do you, like, that is such a powerful definition of art, on how you communicate and can capture narratives and use it in whatever circumstances, including the ones that are very painful and devastating. There is a question that we have, which I don't believe that we are in the position to answer here, but I will try to channel it in a way that we can potentially explore it. So the question is, excellent conversation about decolonization, repeating the Russian-centered narrative in this part of the world. Can you say anything about how the Pittsburgh Ballet will introduce counter-narratives to colonialism in the performances of Swan Lake? It's I'm inviting my distinguished panelists to weigh in, but we do not represent the Pittsburgh Ballet. And I think that, having this conversation is very, hopefully is very fruitful and inspiring to introducing counter narratives. But I will ask our panelists to weigh in and say, do you have any suggestions on how we as a culture here in the United States make sure that we allow space for counter narratives and allow them to thrive and to be welcomed? Adriana? You want to take it?
Quite honestly, when I heard about Swan Lake, I thought that you did it on purpose, because Swan Lake is actually, I mean, I realized that this was it planned earlier, but Swan Lake is one of the most iconic anti-establishment associations. And this really just has to do with it having played on Soviet TV in 1991 as the Soviet Union was falling apart, to hide the realities of what was happening. So if you remember with the Dozh, when the liberal media was taken off the air in Russia, their very last clip was a scene of Swan Lake. I do a lot of research on shortwave radio. I have a few things in the back there. So there's code for Swan Lake. And so Swan Lake has, it appears on what's called these so-called number stations, spy, conspiracy theory type of things. So that when you hear the themes, it has this association. But one of the easiest way to do this is really just to create what we are doing right now, which is a pre-concert panel or a conversation where you're expanding the dialogue and context, because the art is one thing, but it's where it's presented by whom and how people understand it, and in the broader context of what's actually happening now. I think this is the perfect thing that the Pittsburgh Ballet could be doing. So thank you.
And I would just add that I saw Sunday matinee's performance, and regardless of where you line up on this political spectrum, or I've had this ongoing conversation at home about, is it appropriate to be presenting Swan Lake right now? And I made a little bit of the argument about, the ballet has to declare their season, a year in advance, and you can't just pull a production and put something else in its place the way a company like Pittsburgh Ballet Theatre runs. This is just not very feasible to do. But, I do think these conversations are really important. And the other thing I would say is that when you go to see live dance, which is not the same as watching it on video, and so I just implore anyone who's listening, if you aren't someone who attends live dance often, please go to the theater, because the reality of whether it was the great energy of the the word just is escaping me, the Chartists in there was, I think it's in the third act of Swan Lake, and just the physicality that the dancers had, or the tenderness of the act two pas de deux. I have seen that pas de deux many times. It's one that will be done in competitions. It's done as a standalone in a gala and so forth, as well as in the full-length ballet. But I was so impressed with the two artists, and also with the coaching that I assume that Susan Jaffe provided them, that just touches the human spirit in a way that is so very special. And so regardless of all of the other trappings around it, that's the truth. That's the truth of the body. And so I just implore everyone to go enjoy. Go have that experience.
Thank you so much. It's time for us to wrap up. My job here is done, and I'll pass it on to Lisa and Betty. Thank you again for this opportunity to hear and be part of this fascinating discussion.
I thank you as well, and Adriana as well.
Yes, and I would like to thank Mila and Adriana and Elsa so much. Thank you so much for this conversation about Swan Lake, about music and dance, about how we can think about Swan Lake in a new way as we perhaps visit the theater this weekend. So we really appreciate you giving us so many tools to kind of go ahead in a new way with how we view ballet itself. So thank you so much. And thank you to World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, Betty and Olivia, and everybody at World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh for partnering with us on this, on these two programs. And thanks also to All for All Pittsburgh as well.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Lisa, for your partnership and the entire team at the Pittsburgh Ballet Theatre and the All for All Coalition on Immigrant Inclusion. And thank you all of you in the audience for joining us today and caring about the world and this important topic. Until next time, wishing you all peace. Thanks, everyone.